Why does AI need a lot of memory at all? So you just explained, it's important for inference, it's important for training, whatever, but like, why?
Let's say you want to train a model, right? And then you just need to pure tons of data. You need to extract tons of data there to train your model. And then for the inferencing part, like you need one data after another to kind of compute one after another, sort of a chain of thought, right? So to do that process, how can you keep the previous data you process to keep it in there and to process to another data that coming out after, right? So that's why you need a lot of memory. Back to ChatGPT just coming out, people just like, hey, like what's the weather, right? Like very simple questions. People right now or last year, people are doing like, hey, can you write a 20-page report on how cancer can happen on people, right? For example, they will give like 20-page report and they will wait like 5 minutes, right? And so if you think about the process, like they do all the calculation, all the researches, and also give you the output tokens that the sort of the answer you get from your prompt, that's significant way longer than the prompts that you are given, right? And that's also a lot longer response that you are getting when you go back to the GPT-3. And remember, the usage we know back to GPT-3 I forgot the monthly daily users, but right now I think the user for ChatGPT was 800 million, right? And we are not included the users for the Gemini, for Cloud, for XAI, right? So if you multiply those effects, I think the memory demand is very significant and it's very clear to me.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, you know what I'm worried about? I don't know if I'm worried about it, but it kind of feels like the direction things are going, which is that like all energy, industrial commodities, anything that we use for any purpose is just going to like feed the AI beast, and us humans, we're just gonna get left out in the cold. They're like, nothing for you. We gotta feed it all to the AI, and maybe in 10 or 20 or 50 years, the AI is so powerful they just decide why do humans get any of this? We should keep it all to ourselves.
A legitimate concern, I would say. I mean, to some extent, we are already seeing this crowding out effect, right? So energy prices in certain areas have been going up, and most recently, memory chip prices. So this has been all over earnings recently. You had companies like Apple saying that because of a crunch in memory chip supply, they might have to either raise their prices or like cut down on the amount of phones they use. Nintendo, like if you pull up a chart of Nintendo shares right now, they are just getting hammered, and supposedly it is all because of this memory chip shortage. By the way, do you remember like buying your first PC in like, you bought one before I did, I think, but mine was in the mid-90s.
I think that's about when I got one.
Do you remember how much memory those things had?
Oh, like nothing.
Yeah, like I looked it up, something like less than 10 megabytes for a bunch of them. You know how much PCs have nowadays?
Actually, I have no idea.
I think it's, let's see, 16 gigabytes.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
It is really crazy. I remember, like, do you remember zip drives?
Yeah, oh my God.
And there were all these special, obviously various memory peripherals that you could buy, and they came in sort of dedicated cartridges and stuff like that. I think they were called zip drive. Yeah, I think, right? They were zip drive. I don't remember.
Anyway, it was, that's right.
Buying additional memory, storage, et cetera, used to be this big part of the consumer process. I'm actually glad, my son really wants a Nintendo. But if they can't produce them anymore because they can't get the memory, then I'll say, sorry, no video games.
That's so mean. You're going to have to sit him down and be like, I'm so sorry, son. There's this thing called a supply shortage.
Yeah.
I'm going to use this as a learning opportunity to explain how global supply chains actually work.
Totally. You know what the one interesting thing is, if you look at spot DRAM prices, which we have on the terminal, there are a lot. This is, I think, maybe the interesting dynamic. There's a lot of AI-related things on the terminal that have been surging for several years, most notably some of the big chip companies, NVIDIA, et cetera. If you look at a chart of spot DRAM prices, the big surge wasn't until late last year, and then since then it's gone nuts. So for a long time, even as this AI story, the AI meme, the AI industry like propagated, people weren't really paying attention to that area. And then suddenly it's just gone like, the haywire, and so obviously huge supply-demand imbalances. We need to understand what's going on, because I think the stakes are, it's getting so much, as you mentioned, a lot of companies are losing out pretty big. Others are making a lot of money.
Yeah.
We sort of need to get a handle on what's going on with memory.
Let's do it.
I'm really excited to say we really do have the perfect guest. We are going to be speaking with Ray Wang. He's an analyst at SemiAnalysis, and he's recently published a brand new report on exactly this topic, talking about a memory supercycle and so forth. So truly the perfect guest, as I mentioned. He comes to us from Korea. Ray, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Hey, nice to be you both, and thanks for having me.
So many questions. Really appreciate you joining us. Let's just start with the basics. Like, what is it about AI, or what is going on? What is the core idea such that demand for memory in various forms is absolutely seem to be booming right now in a way that caught the supply side of the equation very off guard?
Yeah, I think, to really look at kind of the sort of imbalance supply demand dynamics, really, we want to look at what happened a few years ago, right? Because, your capacity to check like your investment a few years ago, and what's happening, like in 2023 and 2024, it's sort of a down cycle, right? Because remember, during the COVID, all the companies are trying to flock in to buy tons of DRAM. Right, and there's a lot of purchases there, right, and there's sort of like upcycle, right, but it's like a very, very short upcycle, because like when the COVID gradually getting better, right, you actually don't need that much DRAM, and back then the company will be like, hey, you actually don't have a sustainable demand, right, so they don't want to over invest to expand their capacity, and when you go into the down cycle, your CapEx typically being very constrained, very like company from their perspective, they try to be conservative. So that leads to 2024 and 2025 that your incremental wafer capacity that goes to DRAM is actually quite limited. But what's happening on the demand end is actually the demand was accelerating so fast, right? One way to look at it is to look at NVIDIA's earnings, right? And when you on one side, your demand is accelerating so fast. On the other hand, on the supply side, your supply just couldn't catch up, and there's more nuances behind the supply, right? Because before they are just supplying all the commodity DRAM like DDR, LPDDR, right? All the memory that goes to PCs, goes to laptops, goes to your mobiles, goes to Nintendo Switches, right? But what's happening in this AI is like there's a new thing called HBM. Think about it's like a specialized memory directly for AI accelerator, and that memory is extremely DRAM wafer intensive. To give you a sense, right? On the same wafer basis, you can produce 3 more bits if you do commodity DRAM, but you can only produce 1 bit of HBM. Right? And that ratio will actually going higher when you go to HBM4, HBM5 in the next few years, right? So in that way, on the same wafer basis, you can only produce that much HBM. And right now, what's happening is like, hey, this HBM is super profitable, and why not we dedicate more wafer for HBM? But so here's the problem, right? You only have that much wafer, and you try to do everything. So that's crowding out a lot of the supply going to the commodity DRAM, right? So we have sort of both things is happening, and essentially comes down to like, I think really, things start really kind of people aware. It's like probably Q2 2025 that people realize, hey, like, we actually couldn't find enough DRAM, both enough commodity DRAM and also HBM for their demand.
So you mentioned the C word just then. Oh, wait, not that C word, commodities. You mentioned commodities. Yeah. And when I'm reading these articles about a memory chip shortage, people use commodity type language, right? So you hear supercycle a lot. You hear commoditized chips versus, I don't know, other types of chips. Yeah. Are they customized? I don't think so. But anyway, how much does this particular industry actually resemble a commodities-like industry? And then maybe explain a little bit more why historically it has been really, really cyclical.
Yeah, so I think a couple of reasons, right? Fundamentally, the sort of the cost per bit for DRAM was actually coming down every single year significantly, right? Even in the most recent year, it was also coming down, but like the extent that they are coming down for every single year is actually slowing down, like over the past like 10, 20 years, right? So the cost was keep going down, right? So the cost is hard to become like the most competitive part, right? Another thing is there's a sort of a committee that set up the standard for DRAM, right? So, well, you are doing the similar products, right? You're just having, this is kind of a little better power efficiency, as the performance was a little better, right, here and there. So like it's hard for a memory supplier to significantly differentiate their products compared to their competitor, right? So essentially, what's the things that will compete in the end will be the market prices, right? And then if you are selling the similar products and you are targeting similar audience, right? That sort of like are the commodity, sort of semiconductor commodity products to me. And I think those are the two main characteristics I'm seeing for DRAM, and I think that's a little different for HBM.
Explain this. So there's commodity DRAM, and then there's HBM. HBM is a type of DRAM? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Explain this further and walk us through like what the commodity version and why there is this thing called HBM, high bandwidth memory, what that's all about.
Yeah. So essentially, the emergence of HBM is really go down to a kind of model layer, because this is when you like try scaling your AI model, right? Your flops is increasing significantly every single year, right? Because your compute was increased a lot faster, but your memory bandwidth was actually is increasing, but it's very limited. Especially if you are using the memory from kind of traditional commodity DRAM, then the bandwidth is actually very limited. So from a memory supply, they are thinking, hey, like how can we expand the bandwidth to supporting the memory that going to scale the AI, right? So let's consult HBM. So the way they do HBM is they are stacking multiply 8 or 12 or even in the future 16 DRAM dies together, right? So that making you essentially having higher bandwidth and have enough capacity to support AI development over the past few years and in the next few years. And that's very different, right? You are stacking all these dice together compared to we just have like one DRAM product as a chip, right? And also that also comes down to a point that HBM manufacturing, also the packaging, both front end and back end, is a lot more complex compared to commodity DRAM. And that's why I say commodity DRAM is more like commoditized, but I think HBM is less so because it's a lot more complex, right? And for supplier, you can actually differentiate either from the front end or back end technology. And when your yield is better, right, it gives you better margin, better ability to compete with your competitor, right? And stuff like thermal, things like that is the thing that will really stand out, right? And that's very different commodity DRAM.
Getting more and more layers on HBM, it kind of reminds me of the razor wars where Gillette would unveil a 3-blade thing and then the next day someone has like 12 or whatever. So if I'm a company like Nintendo, how am I actually purchasing chips? Because I think this is going to be important when we talk about what's going on right now. But do I have like a forward contract with a major supplier, or do I have, I don't know, a warehouse full of chips that I bought previously? How do they actually manage that?
So there's a couple ways they do it, right? They will do it in terms of they will do it different way, like in different environments and also different vendors, right? So it's hard to say like, hey, this is exactly the way they do it. But typically, I think you can think about like, hey, this is amount of the chips we're gonna purchase in the next 4 months, and this is the amount we're gonna commit, right? And we're gonna sign the contract pricing, whether this term will be 4 months, or for the LTA, you can go as long as to a year or even 2 years, right? So that's typically the way you think about it. But typically you'll be like, hey, we signed this contract for 4 months, right? And by the end, for 3 months for a quarter. So by the end of that quarter, you negotiate the new contract pricing for the next quarter. So that's typically the way it works. But the problem for right now is for consumer electronics is like the pricing probably is sort of, I would say, secondary. Because if you couldn't secure value, you couldn't even make any money, right? So number one is secure value, whether that make sure that fits to the demand outlook you are seeing. 2 is whether you can negotiate the best pricing you can. But given the overall pricing environment was so volatile, was so escalating so much, it's hard to not taking some kinds of margin impacts, because essentially you try to get the chips, right? And you cannot just, get too much away from your vendors.
I want to get more into the demand destruction element, because I think this is very important to think about where the equilibrium is going. But could you just to clarify, what is it about AI specifically? Is it in the training? Is it in the inference? Where specifically in the process of building out AI services does this voracious demand for DRAM come from?
So honestly, to be very honest, I think it's everywhere. like, right, AI training, you need tons of HBM. That just everyone know, right? You also need a lot of the CPU DRAM, and that's LPDDR and the DDR that goes to the server. You also need HBM, right? So that's on the training part. In the inferencing, you also need HBM, right? And you also need the CPU DRAM to go through those workload, right? But the main one will be the HBM. And even the inferencing, right? Right now they are separating to prefill and decode. And I think 80%. I think right now, like, the most important thing will be decode, right? And decode is super like memory bound and memory intensive. And HBM, the memory importance of there will only increase, to my understanding, especially given the long context window continue to expand, and the inference usage and adoptions continue to going up, right? So I think those are the typical way I would think about those, right? And the last thing is, I think a lot of people are talking about these days is about agentic AI. Right? Agentic AI, you want to power those, you need a lot of CPU, you need a lot of CPU-based server, right? So what's including in the CPU server? There's a lot of DRAM in there, right? And a lot of agentic workload also mean you need a lot of inference as well, right? And that go back to my previous point. You need a lot of HBM and DRAM, right? So I will say, like, kind of DRAM and I got HBM and DRAM is kind of everywhere. And we can kind of talk about storage, but storage is also everywhere, in during this process.
I'm sorry if I have a basic question, but why does AI need a lot of memory at all? So you just explained, it's important for inference, it's important for training, whatever, but, like, why?
Yeah, I think this needs to, like, goes down to the model layer, right? Because essentially when you are trying to train, let's say you want to train a model, right? And then you just need to pure tons of data. You need to extract tons of data there to train your model. And then for the inferencing part, like, you need one data after another to kind of compute one after another, sort of a chain of thought, right? So to do that process, how can you keep the previous data you process to keep it there and to process to another data that coming out after, right? So that's why you need a lot of memory. And go back to my previous point, right? The long context window basically means, like, when the things that you are processing longer and longer, right? Like, how can you have enough memory to process those, right? And one of the great example, if you use ChatGPT, you guys definitely remember, right? Back to ChatGPT starts coming out. People just like, hey, like, what's the weather, right? Like, very simple questions. People right now or last year, people are doing like, hey, can you write a 20-page report on how cancer can happen on people, right? For example, they will give like a 20-page report and they will wait like 5 minutes, right? And so if you think about the process, like, they do all the calculation, all the researches, and also give you the output tokens that the sort of the answer you get from your prompt. That's significant, way longer than the prompts that you are given, right? And that's also a lot longer response that you are getting when you go back to the GPT-3. And remember, the usage we know back to GPT-3 I forgot the monthly daily users, but right now I think the use of ChatGPT was 800 million, right? And we are not included the users for the Gemini, for Cloud, for XAI, right? So if you multiply those effects, I think the memory demand is very significant and it's very clear to me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I saw people were talking about this, but it really strikes me in my own usage of AI, just basically how much more I use it as capabilities have grown. Like, it was sort of cute in late 2022. It's like, oh, get it to write a poem about this. And it's like, okay. And then I would go, several weeks sometimes without having anything to query. And then, these days, like, I'm using it all the time, like trying to do things with code or scrape data, et cetera. So just overall token consumption has grown massively with increased capabilities. All right, let's talk about the demand destruction element. Any commodity the price is going to be a function of supply and demand, and eventually prices get high enough such that certain forms of demand just are no longer economical. And it's like, you know what? We're just not going to make as many video games or cameras or whatever else uses memory. Are we starting to see any of that yet, such that certain uses and consumption of memory?
So Joe doesn't have to buy a Switch for his son.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I actually bought a Switch recently. Okay. So the price I haven't seen price hike.
Are you going to resell it?
I don't know. We'll see how the arbitrage there works. But yeah, I think we're already seeing a lot of impacts actually. But it kind of vary in different kinds of product line, right? In PC, we're surely seeing that. Dell, Lenovo, Acer, Asus, they are all having a price hike for kind of different product lines, right? And on the kind of demand side, you're also seeing that I think for the Chinese smartphone market, right, a lot of the analysts, a lot of the research firm, right, a lot of the company was saying like they are cutting off their smartphone outlook. For example, I think MediaTek recently left for earnings, right? They are saying they are cutting off the mobile to, I think it was 12 or 10 to 15% of the 2026 outlook. That's very significant, right? You're saying this year is supposed to be 100 million, but it will essentially goes to 90 million, right? That's very significant. So I think we are already seeing that, but kind of very different places, right? Apple will be a great example here because they are saying, hey, we have all the price hike, right? But we actually managed pretty well. They are saying the real sort of meaningful margin impact will actually show up in the second half 2026 instead of like the first quarter or second quarter. I think those sort of the things I'm seeing. So it's definitely already showing out in the market, right? I think what you can expect this year will be two things. One is sort of demand destruction in PCs, right? The broader consumer electronics, or the DSPEC, whether it's the memory DSPEC, that's very straightforward, but also the camera, right? The camera is also very important. I'm hearing some of the DSPEC on the camera as well. And, also on the sort of what we call like delayed launch, right? Because you don't want to launch your new products that have higher price than initially thought, which will impact your new launch performance, which usually your new launch product have better ASP, better margin compared to your previous generation products, right? I think those are the things we're gonna see in the coming months, in the coming quarters. I think will show impacts and people will start feeling it.
Joe, do you think we're going to get people like stripping old Nintendos for memory chips? Like, remember how during the commodities super cycle in like the early 2010s, I guess, there were all those stories about people like stealing electricity wires.
Yeah,
and
it happened again in
copper.
2021 too, I think. Yeah, we might get some of that.
Well, actually, on that note, is there like a short-term fix for this problem, either in terms of design, maybe you can make the product more efficient in some way so that it needs less memory, or recycling old memory chips? I don't know.
Yeah, I think, from the demand side, it's a lot difficult, right? From the OEM perspective, right? There's only that much you can do, right? You can dispec, right? But I don't think that addresses the fundamental issues, right? You are just dispec your products and so you can ship. But there's this double-edged sword, right? When you downgrade your products, that actually look bad compared to some of your peers who doesn't dispec, right? And make your product less competitive, that impact your final sort of the quarterly or annual shipment. I think what's need to be addressed or what can be done is probably on the supply side, right? So supply side, we are mainly talk about a couple of vendors, right? The Micron, Hynix, Samsung, and for legacy ones, right? You have Winbound, Mania, and China like CSMT and JHICC, right? Those people. So I think the most direct way right now this year, because this year the really challenge is there's a clean room constraint. So clean room constraint is basically you have limited space that you can put all the equipment and start manufacturing chips in the fab, right? So you have clean room shortage in all three major memory makers, right? So your incremental wafer capacity coming online for 2026 will actually be quite limited. So in that sense, how can you produce more bits, more DRAM bits, while having only limited incremental wafer capacity? The only thing you can do is non-migration. So for example, so in DRAM process now you have the most advanced is right now it's 1C, right? Going down, have 1B, 1A, and 1X, blah, 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 right? I think right now they are trying to do is migrate as much as they can to 1B and 1C, which on the same wafer basis, they are produce a lot more bits compared to a legacy node, right? So doing that way on the same wafer basis, you can produce more bits. So that should produce more supply, even though your wafer capacity is constrained. But the challenge is two things. One, how fast you can ramp up this non-migration, right? Non-migration is typically difficult. Well, I won't say difficult. It's it takes time, right? To go into the most advanced node, right? You need EUV machine, right? You need all different kind of manufacturing processes, right? And not every fab can already prepare to doing that, right? So it will take time to ramp up all those production for the new advanced node. Also, you are having the challenge to like, hey, okay, I want to do node migration, right? But how are we going to balance the capacity with HBM? Again, that's another issue you want to kind of think about it, right? Because some of the HBM process now, is actually using, for Hynix, they are using 1B. So that's actually the advanced processor, right? So even you are including 1B, but at the same time you want to do more HBM. So like the increase there is actually quite limited. So I think those are the way can potentially fix the issue. But, from our house view, right? Even we factor all those in, I think this year we're still going to see quite a significant shortage. Yeah.
One of the themes that comes up when we talk about any commodities super cycle is that, sure, higher prices will eventually elicit more production, more supply. But in the meantime, there's a sweet spot for the existing producers, especially when you have just a small number of producers that can produce at scale. They enjoy massive profits, right? And they're sort of going to be reluctant to build out new fabs because that's money going out the door. It also means lower prices. So there's always this sort of Goldilocks period for them before the supply comes online where they're just raking in profits. What do we see is the industry's impulse to invest? And I'm curious, whether it's Chinese producers, are they in a position to potentially undercut the profits of the Korean makers? Are the Korean makers seeing themselves as having a long window where they can enjoy large profits before they have to invest? What is the thinking on the supply side about those big capital outlays?
Yeah, that's a very good strategic question. And I think every management will probably give you a sort of different answer, or kind of on a high level probably same. But I think in general, right, look at historical cycle. It's if we are seeing quite sustainable demand in the next few years, and then clearly the capacity couldn't catch on the demand, they are going to expand the capacity in some time, right? It's probably not going to be hey, we announce in 2026. The capacity really coming online meaningfully is probably 2028. So I think they will still announce, right? And we are seeing that from Micron, right? Micron is announcing a new NAND fab in Singapore, right? They are expanding. They have 2 fabs currently. It's under construction in the US, right? Also doing tons of non-migration, and recently acquired the new fab from PSMC, which is a Taiwanese chip maker, right? And then all those moves, you are already seeing some sign of that. And another sign you are seeing is the CapEx, right? Both the Hynix, Samsung, and Micron, their DRAM CapEx has actually increased quite significant this year, and expect similar trend in 2027. Given I think they're gonna probably try to expand more capacity and invest more in both HBM as well as the equipment that goes to advanced equipment, right? That goes back to the point I was talking about the non-migration. Right? If you want non-migration, you need to use more advanced equipment to produce more advanced chips.
Yeah, it really does remind me of the oil industry,
totally.
right? Where there's a bust in the underlying commodity price, and everyone starts talking about being disciplined on CapEx spend, and so it takes a while to ramp up. I wanted to ask about, I guess, the balance between HBM and other types of DRAM. Yeah. How are people, or how are the actual chip makers thinking about that? And is there a chance that because HBM, my understanding is that it has higher profit margins, is there a chance that everyone just pours into HBM and kind of leaves the more basic stuff in the dust?
Yeah, so actually, it's very interesting. I think what probably since 4Q, we wrote about this for our institutional client, it's that, the margin, well, typically we think HBM has higher margin, right? Which is definitely true. But what's happening, we see all this spot price, contract price going out so much, right? The margin of the commodity DRAM right now is actually higher than HBM. So that created a real dilemma that Tracy, that you talk about it. Because when your margin of commodity DRAM is actually going out higher, why we should make more HBM? Why, right? But I think if you really think about a long-term perspective from a memory supplier, right? Before the all AI boom, your demand is really driving from a couple A market, right? PC, mobile, automotive, industrial, blah, 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 right? HBM right now is surge as a new growth driver for the company, which we believe will last for the next few years, right? And for the memory supplier, they're thinking the same. And if you are not continuing to push your capacity, push your technology, when you're lagging behind, it's hard to coming back. And they go back to my previous point that this is an area that is relatively easier to differentiate your products to get more market share more meaningfully, right? So I think memory makers are very value HBM, even though right now the margin of commodity DRAM is higher, right? I think they will still invest quite a lot on HBM, and they will do their best to sort of balance the commodity DRAM market. But I think I think this year, at least the number I'm seeing is still quite significant shortage. Yeah.
How do the Chinese producers compare to the Korean producers? Is there a gap?
Oh yeah, I think there's definitely the gap. I think if you look at the memory in general, I think it's probably 3 years is fair to say. HBM it's probably 4 years, I would say. That this is very time. This is like kind of as of today. Who knows what's gonna happen in the future? But I think there's definitely a gap. When I think about the competition pressure from Chinese memory makers, we always want to kind of separate the Chinese market and also the ex-China market. That's also the memory supply was looking at it, right? So Chinese market is probably about 25% of the global DRAM demand. So really, the competition is happening in China because for the leading Chinese memory supplier like CSMT, for example, I believe like 90% or 95% of the revenue is coming from China and Hong Kong. Hong Kong, right? So meaning, most of the DRAM is really competing Chinese market, compete with Micron, Hynix, and Samsung. I would say that right now on the advanced, on the high end, right? I think it was still dominated by three memory makers, but CSMT are getting two momentum, right? One, they are probably getting sort of a low end and medium products, and they are also benefited by Chinese government's policy in terms of the self-sufficiency drive to, whether it's for the commodity DRAM, also right now they are pushing for HBM developments that support Chinese AI hardware.
So if there's a shortage, and it seems like the shortage is going to be with us for some time, how are the chip makers actually allocating what supply they have? Does it go to, the company that I think is going to be really big and important in the future, like, I don't know, an OpenAI or something? Or does it go to an existing customer that's been buying in volume from me for years?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt to me that some of the highest tier customer will get a value for sure. Of course, there's a more complex pricing negotiation behind, but I will say like the value will be the most important thing, and I think that's probably what they're gonna do, right? And besides thinking about like by customer, I will think about kind of by sector. I will say the server DRAM and HBM, two things together will be the top priority. Because if for the whole A market in DRAM, we are seeing actually HBM and server DRAM together is probably it's more than half of the DRAM market, right? And that's important, and it's growing so fast, right? And it's unlike the mobile, right? Mobile is kind of flat. The mobile demand is really driven by the increased DRAM contents in the mobile, which is quite limited, right? If you buy iPhone over the past year, they are actually quite limited on their DRAM content increase. So I think those are the top two priorities for the memory company to focus on in the next 2-3 years, and we'll see what happens. After second half of 2027 or 2028, if there's some structural change. But I think server DRAM and HBM will be the top priorities.
The other day I was very lazy, which is not rare for me.
Just that one day.
Just one day, and I used Claude Code. I have a bunch of screenshots on the desktop of my computer, and it sort of makes my desktop look like a mess, and I can't see folders, so I drag and drop them and put them in the recycling bin. And I was very lazy, and I put it to Claude Code. I said, clean up my desktop, clean up my desktop. And I was like, this is so insane. I'm using, Anthropic's computers, wherever they are on the other side of the country, to clean up my own computer's desktop. Why do I even have my own computer?
Did it do a good job?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it did great. And I was like, why do I even have my own computer at this point? I started wondering, I'm like, why do I even have a computer? So related to this sort of DRAM question, could we just get into a situation in which people don't really have their own compute on their own device, because more that like Anthropic's brain is sort of, or OpenAI's brain is sort of controlling the things we use? Why not just have a very low spec computer or low spec phone or whatever, or low memory, whatever, because I'm already using their computers, etc. And are we just going to see whether memory or elsewhere this sort of migration where all of the interesting stuff and all of the memory and all of the compute happens elsewhere, and my phone just becomes a sort of, or my computer just becomes a screen with an internet access?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the idea not having the personal devices.
Yeah,
but
I might have
will
the
say
physical device, but it just sort of seems over time. Does it make sense for me to have all of this actual compute inside my house when I'm just like, oh, I might as well let them.
Well, I will say like depend. Yeah, I will say it depends on like what's your end purpose, right? For example, laptop, for example, right? Like if you are doing like video editing very heavy, right? You probably still you probably still need quite a lot of DRAM, right? If you are just doing like document work, right? How cold depends on how you're gonna use it. If you are using like super intensively, I think you still need like quite good DRAM, especially you are like pulling all different API from different places, right? So I will say it just really depends on the end purpose. I don't think like at least I haven't seen like there will be like kind of structural sort of DRAM destruction in the devices from agentic AI.
So going back to the beginning of this conversation and the cyclicality of the industry, people have been throwing around the term supercycle, again, very commodities-esque. Is this just a supercycle, maybe bigger than previous turns that we've seen throughout history? Or do you think something structural has shifted here, perhaps given the rise of AI and the fact that Joe is, using Claude to clean up his desktop?
This is actually a very dangerous question to real. You are basically asking, right, whether this time is different, right?
Right.
I think I think there's a couple of things that actually rhymes with the history, right? The non-migration, fake capacity, right? Those things. But I would say there's kind of difference I'm seeing, right? Because we rarely see in a sort of super cycle that there's a new demand driver coming online. It's not only constrain the demand, this thing is also constrain the supply, right? Because for example, in 2010 to 2012, there's a super cycle driven by mobile, right? So mobile is basically, hey, we have a new product coming online and it requires a lot of DRAM, and our capacity couldn't catch up. But right now for HBM, it's like, hey, okay, we need to do HBM, but your HBM is actually constrain your commodity DRAM capacity. So I think this is the key difference that we are seeing for this, right? Apparently, the demand accelerations is also last quite long, right? And if you're really starting counting the sort of, I would say, the AI acceleration in terms of demand, probably let's say second half of 2023 when NVIDIA really start kind of emerging in people's attention. That's like to now is almost probably like let's say 3 years, right? 2.5, 3 years, and we are looking at this cycle to last until let's say safely to say like second half of 27, right? So we are looking at like kind of 4-year cycle. That's quite rare in the history. The usually like the cycle, if you look at historically for the memory, it's probably like 15 months, like the probably longest like 18 months from start to its peak. But right now we are going through an area that was like, hey, the demand was going up, not the price directly, but the demand at least was growing quite significantly over the past few years, right? And the pricing impact is happening right now, starting from probably Q2 2025. Yeah.
Well, when you say, okay, the cycle could end by 2027 or the second half of 2027, what are the ingredients for it to slow down? Is it the more production capacity? Is it a slowdown in total demand? Like what do you see potentially happening in 2027 that brings supply and demand more into balance?
Yeah, so I won't say like it will end. I will say like it's a more tricky area to sort of estimate. Because based on the number I'm modeling, we are seeing here, it's actually we are seeing the demand is actually going to, the demand is actually going higher and the shortage is actually going to worse. And the part of that is because NVIDIA's AI server, their DRAM content was going to 3x compared to Blackwell, right? And then if you look at the demand,
an NVIDIA server,
the Lubin 200, yeah.
Okay.
Lubin Ultra, Lubin 300, right? And if that's the case, and the demand was continue to be that strong, right? Your HBM shortage should even be worse compared to 26, and your DRAM should go worse, right? Because the memory maker is gonna try to make more HBM wafer, right? And that kind of counting out more on commodity DRAM. I think the reason I say it's more tricky because two things. I mentioned about a lot of non-migration. It's actually happening this year. It's also going to happen in 2027, right? So tons of non-migration are going to come online and being completed. So that will add a lot of additional bits for the memory supplier. Additionally, the wafer should have a lot more coming online by the end of 26 and for throughout 2027, right? So I think those are the two variables that you want to factor in. From what I'm seeing, at least, I think like 2027, DRAM gonna still be shortage. Yeah.
We need a strategic memory chip
we
reserve,
do.
right?
Yeah.
Put a floor on prices in the cycle. Actually, on that note, do you see a lot of stockpiling in the market or panic buying right now where people are seeing these forecasts and they're freaking out and just buying whatever they can?
How you get a bullwhip effect.
That's right.
Yeah, it's hard to say no, right? Like, one of the good, I think the signal you're seeing in Hynix, Samsung, and Micron, their DRAM inventory was dropping every single quarter since I think Q3 2025, right? And that's just one of the signals that you are not just buying the sort of the products on the shelf, right? And the products that coming online in that quarter. You're also buying the products that in their inventory, right? You're trying to get as much of the product as you can. And given all the demand and how AI is developed so fast, like by monthly basis, it's hard to say like, hey, there's no sort of preemptive purchasing behavior happening, right? And especially when the hyperscalers and the leading AI labs, they're competing with each other very intensively. Securing capacity on the hardware is sort of the baseline, right? You want to get the best equipment that you can compete, right? Yeah.
So obviously, if I'm buying a Nintendo Switch or if I'm buying a PC or maybe some sort of consumer device, then the increased memory cost is a meaningful driver of that. And maybe, the company will have to raise prices and maybe I won't buy it or whatever, and you might get this. What about like for the big hyperscalers? When we see these huge capital expenditure numbers from the likes of a Microsoft or an Amazon, do these prices changes move the dial at these levels in terms of, do they affect anything when we're talking about these buyers?
Yeah, I don't think, number one, for sure, right? I think the CapEx is not really, well, the CapEx increase is not because of the DRAM price increase,
Sure, yeah.
but the DRAM price increase does gonna have some kinds of impacts to their purchases of memory, right? Assuming the hyperscalers are the direct buyer of the memory, which is not necessarily the case in kind of different locations, right? So if they, assuming they are the direct buyers of the memory, for sure, right? If your initial goal was using 100 million to buy a certain amount of memory, right now you probably need to do some discount there, for sure. Especially this thing is probably the discount gonna be more and more in the coming quarter, right? So one of the things they are trying to do, but it's still very difficult. It's like they try to have a long-term agreement, right? To have a secure commit large value for the year basis and to hopefully to have better pricing. But it's really hard to achieve that because why the memory supplier want to do that, right? We can negotiate the pricing in a quarterly basis. We can actually get more money, right? And especially given the current pricing and supply demand environment.
Ray Wang, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots. Really the perfect guest. Let's stay in touch and maybe we'll revisit it in 2027 to see if things have eased.
Yeah, hopefully.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Ray. Take care, Ray. That was great. Tracy, that was fun. I do feel like there's a lot of moving pieces there, but just from AI in general, the crowding out effect is such a big part of the story. When you saw those big capital expenditure plans for 2027, like these are real macro drivers. They're going to show up in CPI, et cetera, like that. And because it's like, maybe we'll get a lot of productivity gains in the future. But right now, the pace of spending is so furious. It is like a fiscal boom.
Yeah.
A fiscal stimulus.
This is what happens when some of the world's biggest companies and most cash-rich companies decide that this is an existential threat, right? There's no upward limit on how much they're willing to spend in order to survive. And so you could just throw money at HBM chips, I guess, and then you get the chip makers going, well, actually, like, we want to produce a bunch of HBM, like, forget about DRAM, all of that stuff.
I do think, like, when it comes to some of the data center and energy stuff, it's a little ambiguous how much it's affecting energy prices right now, but already the politics of that is very fraud. And then you're going to start upsetting the gamer community because they can't get NVIDIA has talked about curtailing
Big
some
mistake.
of it. And then they're going to upset my son because he can't get a Nintendo Switch, etc. People are just going to start feeling it more and more, the sort of visceral reality that various resources that they thought they could get abundantly, it's like, nope, we've switched this line over to the data centers, over to AI, and it's going to become more, this crowding out effect is going to become more and more real to people directly.
Which is so ironic because when you think about AI, it's this thing that exists in the ether, right? But at the same time, it has this huge physical impact on the real world. It's kind of funny, and I guess like not what a lot of people would have expected.
No, I suppose not. The DRAM people, anyone who has a terminal or should just look up DRAM prices, because this is.
I thought you were going to say anyone who has a terminal should start stripping out their memory chips.
Everyone who has a terminal should just unscrew the back and pull out the DRAM. No, but if people should just look at the chart, because here's this thing that's very sleepy. I mean, this was true commoditized tech. This was the low end in terms of what people were excited about in chips and so forth. And as Ray mentioned in the beginning, costs generally around this downward trend and so forth because growth was modest and technology continues to improve. And then it literally just looks like an L. Yeah. Really in like the last 4 months, just gone completely nuts. And so, yeah, kind of a fascinating spot to watch. And it's just interesting to the point that you were making, how much it really is like a commodity super cycle.
Yeah.
A commodity cycle.
I guess in 2027, maybe we'll find out.
We'll see if it balances out.
Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
All right. This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our guest, Ray Wang. He's at rwang07. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Cale Brooks at Cale Brooks.
And if you want more Odd Lots content, then you can find that, including our daily newsletter over at bloomberg.com/oddlots.
And you can chat about all of these topics 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, then please like the video, leave a comment, or better yet, subscribe.
Thanks for watching.